Captured in the aftermath of a war that shattered countless lives, Grigory Zhivayev, a 22-year-old Russian soldier, sits across from his interviewer. His face is marked not by the confidence of a warrior, but the unease of a man grappling with his own story. He insists he never wanted to be here, that he was swept into the conflict by forces beyond his control. Yet, the facts don't align. How does a man, conscripted, trained, and armed, find himself in a foreign land if he claims he never fired a single shot? What drives a person to invade another's home, to stand on soil soaked with the blood of innocents, and yet proclaim himself a victim? As the interview unfolds, Grigory paints himself as a reluctant participant, a cog in the machine of war. But his story is riddled with contradictions. Beneath his words lies a deeper tale, one of coercion, denial, and moral ambiguity. Was he truly a helpless pawn, or did he choose the path that led him here? This is the story of Grigory Zhivayev, and it's one you won't forget. The war in Ukraine, ignited by Russia's unjust invasion, has left an indelible scar on millions of lives. What began under the guise of a special military operation quickly unraveled into a brutal campaign of aggression and occupation. Cities once vibrant with life have been reduced to rubble, their streets littered with the remnants of shattered homes and lives. Families have been torn apart, displaced by violence, or destroyed entirely. The echoes of artillery fire and missile strikes have replaced the sounds of peace, creating a harrowing backdrop to a conflict rooted in deception and power. Behind this war lies a chilling truth. It is not merely a military operation, but the product of a relentless propaganda machine. For years, Russian state media has bombarded its citizens with narratives designed to dehumanize Ukraine, branding it as a land controlled by Nazis and extremists. These claims, devoid of truth, were crafted to instill fear and anger in the hearts of ordinary Russians, to paint their neighbors as threats and justify acts of aggression. This campaign of disinformation has not only fueled the war, but also ensured the compliance of millions who believe they are fighting a righteous battle. For individuals like Grigory Zhivayev, this propaganda became an inescapable part of their reality. A 22-year-old from a small town in Russia, he was among thousands swept up in Russia's controversial mobilization drive. The government's draft targeted young men in rural areas, far from the metropolitan centers where dissent is more visible. These men were often coerced into service with little preparation or understanding of what awaited them. Refusing the draft was not an option for most. For many, defiance meant severe punishment, fines, imprisonment, or threats against their families. Faced with impossible choices, they boarded buses and trains bound for a war they neither started nor fully understood. But Grigory's story is not unique. It is emblematic of the systemic manipulation that underpins this conflict. These recruits were promised honor, duty, and protection of their homeland. Instead, they were handed weapons and sent into a foreign country to fight for reasons obscured by lies. Grigory himself admits to consuming only state-sanctioned news that omitted the brutal reality of the war. It painted the invasion as a mission to save Ukraine, not destroy it. Yet, his experiences on the battlefield would tell a very different story. This war, fueled by deceit, is not just a geopolitical struggle. It's a human tragedy. The victims are not only the civilians whose homes are shattered or the soldiers who lose their lives, but also the men like Grigory, used as pawns in a game they were never meant to understand. As his story unfolds, it becomes a testament to the devastating power of propaganda, the cost of blind obedience, and the fragility of truth in a world built on manipulation and fear. Grigory Zhivayev's story is riddled with contradictions, each one raising questions about his true role in the war. From the moment he begins recounting his journey, he portrays himself as a victim of circumstance, a young man plucked from a quiet life in rural Russia and thrust into a war he claims he neither wanted nor understood. Yet, even as he insists on his innocence, the details of his account reveal a deeper, more troubling reality. Grigory describes himself as an unwilling participant, forced into service under the threat of imprisonment. He paints a picture of a man with no choice but to comply, describing how a summons arrived at his door, giving him mere hours to prepare for departure. He tells of his wife's tearful objections, his own hesitations, and his hope that the conflict would somehow resolve before he ever had to fire a shot. But his words are haunted by the truth of his actions. He crossed a border armed and in uniform, joining an occupying force that brought destruction and suffering to a sovereign nation. How does a man claim innocence while standing in the midst of a war zone? He insists he never killed anyone, never fired a single round. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he repeats, as if saying it enough times might make it true. But when pressed about his presence in Ukraine, he acknowledges the nature of his mission. He admits to being part of an occupying army, to entering a foreign land against the will of its people. He tries to reconcile this with his claim that he was only following orders. Yet, the very essence of his admission, that he invaded another country, undermines his plea for absolution. How can he see himself as a victim when he contributed to the terror felt by those he helped displace? The contradictions deepen as Grigori recounts his training. He describes how he and his unit were prepared for combat, taught to use weapons and follow commands. He recalls the week spent near Volnovakha, standing guard at a base, fully aware of the war raging around him. Yet, he clings to the narrative that he wasn't part of the violence. When asked why he didn't refuse to serve, he explains the impossible choices he faced: obey or face imprisonment. But even as he invokes coercion, he acknowledges the decisions he made that led him to stand on Ukrainian soil. Grigori's narrative also struggles to account for his emotions. He speaks of fear, regret, and longing for his family, but when confronted with the suffering of Ukrainians, his responses become vague, even dismissive. He admits he didn't think about the consequences of his actions before being captured. His explanations, when compared to the devastation he witnessed, feel hollow. How does a man grapple with his complicity in a war he claims to reject? As the interviewer challenges his story, Grigori's defenses begin to unravel. His claims of innocence clash with the undeniable truth of his presence in Ukraine, his role in an occupation that left lives destroyed. These contradictions form the heart of his tale, a man desperate to reconcile the life he lived before the war with the choices he made during it. And as his story unfolds, it leaves us questioning, was he truly a victim of circumstance, or does his guilt run deeper than he's willing to admit? Grigory Jivaev was born on May 29, 2000, in Chita, a quiet city in Zabaykovsky Krai, Russia. The region, marked by its expansive forests and rolling hills, offered a life of simplicity but also one of limitations. For Grigori, childhood was defined by the modesty of his surroundings: a small house, an inherited plot of land, and a family that taught him the value of hard work. Life in Chita moved at a slow, predictable pace, a rhythm that shaped his earliest dreams and ambitions. Grigori's family life was far from idyllic. His parents divorced when he was young, leaving him and his siblings to grow up under the watchful eye of their mother. She worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, instilling in Grigori a deep respect for perseverance. Despite the challenges, there was a sense of stability in their home. The small house on their plot of land, passed down from his grandfather, was both a symbol of their heritage and a practical necessity. It required constant upkeep, firewood to be chopped, a garden to be tended, but it provided a measure of self-reliance that Grigori would carry into adulthood. From a young age, Grigori understood the weight of responsibility. While his peers in larger cities might dream of luxury or adventure, his aspirations were grounded in the practical. His days were spent balancing schoolwork with chores, whether it was harvesting vegetables or helping to maintain their aging home. Yet, even amidst the routine of rural life, Grigori allowed himself to dream, inspired by detective novels and stories of justice. He harbored ambitions of one day solving mysteries and bringing order to chaos. His journey toward those ambitions began at a local technical school, where he earned a vocational qualification as a railway conductor and ticket clerk. These were steady, respectable roles that offered a semblance of stability, and Grigori embraced the opportunity to better his prospects. Alongside his studies, he pursued additional certifications, qualifying as a 6th-grade private detective and a security guard. To him, these credentials represented not just potential careers, but a pathway to something more fulfilling than the life he had known. But life had its way of curbing his aspirations. His dreams of working on the railway were dashed when he failed the physical health requirements, his poor eyesight preventing him from passing the necessary exams. It was a bitter blow, one that forced him to reassess his path. Undeterred, he took up work as a stoker in a boiler room, shoveling coal and managing machinery in grueling shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. To supplement his income, he took on side jobs as a construction worker and a loader, making use of his physical strength to earn just enough to support himself. At just 22 years old, Grigori had already experienced more setbacks than many his age. Yet, he approached life with a quiet resilience, finding pride in the small victories: a house inherited from his grandfather, a garden that provided food, and a wife who stood by his side. Together, they built a modest life in Chita, one defined by routine but also by hope for the future. Despite his efforts to create stability, Grigory's life was constrained by the limits of rural Russia. The opportunities he sought were often out of reach, his dreams curtailed by economic realities and systemic barriers. Still, he clung to the belief that hard work would eventually lead to a better life. But as the years passed, his quiet frustrations grew. The disparity between his ambitions and his reality began to weigh on him, leaving him vulnerable to the sweeping forces of political and social upheaval that would soon consume his country and his life. Grigory's story begins here, in the quiet streets of Chita. It is the story of a young man shaped by his surroundings, guided by modest dreams, and unaware of how drastically his life would change. It was a life lived far from the battlefields, yet one that would ultimately lead him there, drawn into a conflict that would forever alter his understanding of duty, identity, and choice. Grigory Jivaev's family life was a microcosm of the broader struggles faced by many in small-town Russia. Born into a working-class household, he grew up in a world where survival often took precedence over ambition. His mother, a resilient woman who became the cornerstone of the family after her divorce, worked tirelessly to provide for her children. For Grigory, this early exposure to hardship instilled a sense of responsibility, but also a quiet resignation to the limitations of his circumstances. The Jivaev family was not wealthy, nor did they pretend to be. Their home, a modest house inherited from Grigory's grandfather, stood as a symbol of both their pride and their struggle. Maintaining it required constant effort, repairing the roof, chopping firewood, tending the garden, and every member of the family contributed. For Grigory, these tasks were part of life's rhythm, but they also underscored the lack of opportunities that defined his upbringing. There were no luxuries, no grand vacations, just the steady grind of making ends meet. Economic challenges shaped much of Grigory's worldview. Jobs in Chita were scarce, and those available often paid just enough to survive. His mother, juggling multiple roles, impressed upon him the value of hard work, but she also carried the burden of unmet dreams. Grigory's father, largely absent after the divorce, contributed little to the household, leaving his mother to shoulder the family's financial and emotional needs. This absence created a void in Grigory's life, one he rarely spoke about but which silently influenced his sense of duty and identity. As he entered his teenage years, Grigory began to feel the weight of societal expectations pressing down on him. In his community, the path to manhood was clear: find work, support your family, and keep your head down. Ambition beyond this was often met with skepticism, as if dreaming too big was an invitation to failure. Grigory's modest aspirations, to become a railway conductor or a detective, were shaped as much by his own interests as by these unspoken rules. He wanted stability, a sense of purpose, and a way to contribute to his family, but he also felt constrained by the narrow paths available to him. The societal pressures extended beyond career choices. As a young man in rural Russia, Grigory was expected to marry, build a household, and provide for his family. By the time he turned 20, he had married his childhood sweetheart, solidifying his role as a provider. Together, they moved into the house he inherited, trying to carve out a life amidst the challenges of their surroundings. The garden became a lifeline, providing food during lean months, while side jobs supplemented his meager income. Every decision Grigory made was influenced by the need to fulfill his obligations, not just to his wife, but to the family legacy he inherited. Despite his efforts, the economic struggles of rural life remained ever present. Wages were low, and jobs were unstable. Grigory often worked long hours at construction sites or as a stoker in a boiler room, earning barely enough to cover basic expenses. The dream of rising above his circumstances seemed increasingly out of reach, and the gap between his aspirations and reality began to take a toll. He longed for more but saw few avenues to achieve it. The systemic barriers, poor infrastructure, limited education, and a lack of upward mobility felt insurmountable. Grigory's life was further shaped by the pervasive influence of Russian society's unyielding expectations. He was taught to respect authority, to value loyalty to his country, and to accept his place in the social hierarchy without question. These ideals, reinforced by state propaganda and community norms, left little room for dissent or individuality. Grigory grew up internalizing these values, believing that hard work and obedience were the keys to a stable life. Yet, beneath this exterior, he wrestled with a quiet frustration, a yearning for a different kind of life that seemed impossible to attain. Family and societal pressures molded Grigory into the man he became, diligent, resilient, and deeply tied to his roots. But they also left him vulnerable to the forces that would later draw him into the war. His need to fulfill his duties to his family, combined with the limitations of his environment, created a perfect storm of coercion and compliance. Grigory's choices, shaped by these pressures, would lead him far from the life he envisioned, into a conflict that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, honor, and survival. When the call to arms came, Grigory Jivaev was not eager to answer. Like many young men in Russia's small towns, he had little interest in a conflict that felt distant and unnecessary. To him, the war in Ukraine was something he heard about on the news, a vague, politicized event that seemed to belong to a world far removed from his daily struggles in Chita. Yet, as the mobilization orders began sweeping across the country, it became clear that the war was no longer something he could ignore. Grigory's reluctance was immediate and visceral. He didn't see himself as a soldier. His life, while modest, was rooted in routine and responsibility, work shifts tending to the family garden, and trying to build a stable future with his wife. The thought of leaving it all behind for a cause he didn't believe in filled him with dread. When the first rumors of mobilization reached Chita, Grigory hoped he might somehow avoid it. After all, he reasoned, there were so many others in Russia better suited for the military. But hope soon turned to fear as conscription notices began arriving in his community. For Grigory, the arrival of his draft notice felt like a hammer blow. He remembers the day vividly, an official envelope delivered with cold efficiency, summoning him to report for duty. It offered no room for negotiation, no chance to appeal. The consequences for refusal were clear: fines, imprisonment, or worse. Grigory's immediate thought was for his wife and family. Who would support them if he ended up in jail? The government's demands were absolute, and resistance was a risk he couldn't afford to take. The days leading up to his departure were filled with a suffocating sense of inevitability. Grigory tried to argue with himself, searching for reasons to justify compliance. Perhaps, he thought, the situation would resolve before he reached the front. Perhaps his role would be limited to logistics or support, far from the violence of combat. He clung to these fragile hopes, even as he packed his belongings and prepared to leave the only life he had ever known. Grigory's reluctance turned to quiet despair as he joined the hundreds of other recruits in Chita, all herded together like cattle and sent to distant training camps. The experience was dehumanizing, a stark reminder of the powerlessness he felt. The government's mobilization drive operated with ruthless efficiency, targeting men from small towns and rural areas where resistance was minimal. For many, including Grigory, it felt like an act of coercion disguised as patriotism. Training offered little reassurance. Grigory was handed a weapon, given minimal instruction, and thrust into a world that felt alien and hostile. The camaraderie he had hoped to find among his fellow conscripts was replaced by an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Few of the men believed in the cause they were being sent to fight for, but none dared voice their doubts openly. Instead, they focused on surviving the grueling regimen, all the while haunted by the knowledge of where they were headed. Throughout it all, Grigory's reluctance never wavered. He didn't see himself as a soldier or a patriot. He was a man trying to endure an impossible situation, torn between his obligations to his family and the demands of a government that offered no choice. On the surface, he complied with orders, but inside he wrestled with the moral weight of his actions. He didn't want to be part of this war. He didn't want to carry a gun, let alone use it. And yet, his presence in the conflict was inevitable. A product of the relentless machinery of mobilization that turned unwilling citizens into tools of war. As the day of his deployment drew closer, Grigory felt a growing sense of resignation. He wasn't going to war as a believer in its cause or as a defender of his nation's interests. He was going because he had no other option. The fear of punishment outweighed his objections, and the weight of societal expectations silenced his doubts. When he finally boarded the train that would take him to Ukraine, he left behind not just his home and family, but a piece of himself, his autonomy, his dreams, and his belief that he could shape his own destiny. Grigory Jivaev was now a soldier, not by choice, but by coercion. And as he stared out the window at the receding landscape of his hometown, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever return. The journey to Ukraine began with a bitter chill of inevitability. Grigory Jivaev, along with dozens of other conscripts, boarded the train that would take them away from everything they had known. Packed into cramped compartments, the men sat in silence, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. The train rattled over tracks that seemed to stretch endlessly, carrying them toward a destination most of them would rather forget. Grigori, staring out the window, tried to make sense of what lay ahead. The idyllic life he left behind in Chita felt like a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing dread of the unknown. Training had done little to prepare him for the reality of war. It was rushed and chaotic, focused more on compliance than competence. Grigori was handed an aging rifle and taught the bare minimum of soldiering, how to load, aim, and fire. The drills were grueling, but they lacked any real connection to the battlefield scenarios he would soon face. Much of the time was spent on marching drills and basic discipline, the instructors barking orders with a detached monotony. The conscripts were treated less like individuals and more like numbers, their worth determined by their ability to follow commands without question. Grigori felt out of place among his fellow recruits. Many were young and inexperienced, just like him, but others were older, men who had lived fuller lives and carried heavier burdens. Some spoke openly of their anger at being forced into service. Others remained silent, their expressions betraying resignation. The camaraderie Grigori had hoped to find was sparse, replaced by a shared sense of dread. They were all heading to the same place, but no one wanted to admit what that truly meant. As the train neared Ukraine, the atmosphere grew tense. The men exchanged worried glances, their conversations hushed. They had heard stories of what awaited them, stories of chaos, destruction, and death. Grigori clung to the faint hope that he might be assigned to a non-combat role, perhaps guarding a supply depot or manning a checkpoint far from the front lines. But deep down, he knew better. He could see it in the eyes of the officers who inspected them at every stop, their expressions a grim reminder that this was no routine deployment. The transition from training to active duty was jarring. Grigori's unit was stationed near Volnovakha, a once quiet town now transformed into a staging ground for conflict. The journey from the train station to their base was an introduction to the harsh realities of war. The roads were littered with the remnants of battle, burned-out vehicles, makeshift barricades, and craters from artillery strikes. The air smelled of smoke and diesel, mingling with the distant echo of gunfire. It was a far cry from the quiet streets of Chita. When they arrived at the base, Grigori's first impression was one of disarray. The camp was hastily constructed, with tents and trenches scattered haphazardly across the landscape. Supplies were scarce, and morale was lower than he had imagined. The seasoned soldiers, hardened by months of combat, barely acknowledged the newcomers. Grigori felt like an outsider, a raw recruit thrown into a world he didn't understand. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't just a deployment. This was war. The first night at the base was sleepless. Grigori lay in his bunk, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire. It was a sound that would become all too familiar in the days to come. His thoughts drifted to his family, to the life he had left behind, and to the uncertainty of his future. He tried to convince himself that he could endure this, that he could survive without losing himself in the process. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of his predicament grew heavier. The initial shock of war came not in a single moment, but in a series of realizations. The next morning, Grigori was assigned to patrol duty. As he walked the perimeter of the base, rifle in hand, he couldn't help but notice the destruction that surrounded them. Fields once lush with crops were now barren and scorched. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The few civilians he saw were weary and withdrawn, their faces reflecting the toll of occupation. Grigori avoided their gazes, unsure of what to say or feel. By the end of his first week near Volnovakha, the shock had given way to numbness. The routine of war, patrols, drills, and the ever-present tension left little room for reflection. But in quiet moments, Grigori couldn't escape the truth of his situation. He was no longer a spectator to the conflict. He was part of it. The choices he had made, or felt forced to make, had brought him here. And as the days turned into weeks, he began to understand that the war would not only test his body, but also his soul. Grigori Jivaev's early days near Volnovakha were an unsettling introduction to the violence that defined the war. Though he claimed he never fired a single shot, his accounts of the scenes he witnessed tell a story steeped in destruction and death. The brutality of the conflict was inescapable, and despite his assertions of innocence, Grigori found himself surrounded by the devastating consequences of war. The first time Grigori encountered death was during a routine patrol. He and his unit had been ordered to secure the perimeter of a small village recently occupied by Russian forces. As they approached the outskirts, the smell hit him first, a pungent mix of smoke, rot, and burnt earth. The village was eerily quiet, its streets deserted except for the debris of war. Burned-out cars blocked narrow roads, and the charred remains of homes stood as grim reminders of the battles fought there. Grigori recalls seeing bodies for the first time. They were scattered across the village square, some in civilian clothing, others in tattered uniforms. He remembers one particular figure, a man slumped against the remnants of a wall, his hand clutching a photograph of a family. The sight haunted Grigori, though he tried to push it out of his mind. "I didn't do it," he insisted during his interview. "I wasn't the one who caused this." But as the interviewer pressed him on his presence in the village, it became clear that his role, however passive he believed it to be, contributed to the chaos. Another incident unfolded during a night patrol on the edge of the front lines. Grigori and his unit were stationed near a stretch of road frequently used by Ukrainian forces to transport supplies. The tension was palpable. The men spoke in whispers, their movements deliberate and cautious. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the night, a mortar strike aimed at their position. Grigori remembers the deafening sound, the flash of light, and the chaos that followed. 2 soldiers from his unit were killed instantly, their bodies thrown meters away by the blast. Grigori froze, clutching his rifle but unable to move or react. "I didn't shoot back," he explained. "I just hid and waited for it to stop." The destruction wasn't limited to combat zones. Grigori described an unsettling scene he witnessed while accompanying a convoy through another village. As their vehicles rolled through the narrow streets, he saw civilians lining the roadside, some glaring silently, others with tears streaming down their faces. A woman clutched a small child, her eyes hollow with fear. Further ahead, an older man knelt by a makeshift grave, marked only by a wooden cross and a soldier's helmet. Grigori didn't speak to the villagers, nor did he acknowledge them. "We were told not to engage," he said, but his silence spoke volumes. He was a part of the force that had invaded their homes, even if he never fired his weapon. One of the most harrowing experiences Grigori recounted involved a building that had been shelled during an offensive. The structure, a modest schoolhouse, had been reduced to rubble. Grigori and his unit were ordered to search the debris for survivors or potential threats. Amid the destruction, he found remnants of a classroom, charred desks, scattered textbooks, and a child's drawing pinned to a broken chalkboard. The image, a simple depiction of a house and a smiling family, stood in stark contrast to the devastation around him. He claimed he didn't see any civilians in the wreckage, but his voice faltered as he spoke, as if the memory weighed heavier than he admitted. Throughout his interview, Grigori maintained that he was not directly involved in the violence. He repeated that he never fired a shot, never aimed his rifle at another human being. "I was just there," he said. "I didn't do anything." But the interviewer's questions painted a different picture. By being present, by occupying these towns and villages, Grigori was complicit in the suffering he witnessed. Whether he pulled the trigger or not, his role as a soldier in an invading army contributed to the destruction around him. These encounters with violence left a mark on Grigori, though he struggled to articulate their impact. He admitted to feeling numb after a while, a coping mechanism to survive the horrors he saw daily. But his attempts to distance himself from the violence raised questions about his understanding of his own culpability. How could he claim innocence when his mere presence, his uniform, and his weapon symbolized the force that brought death and destruction to these communities? Grigori's encounters with violence were not isolated moments, but part of a larger pattern of devastation that followed the war wherever it went. The bodies, the shattered homes, the grieving civilians. Each scene was a testament to the brutality of the conflict and the role soldiers like Grigori played, willingly or not. His insistence on not firing a shot may have been true, but it did little to absolve him of the consequences of his presence in a war zone. These memories, seared into his mind, told a story that Grigori himself seemed reluctant to confront. And as he spoke, it became clear that his narrative was one of denial, an attempt to reconcile his actions with the unbearable reality of what he had witnessed. Grigori Jivaev's story begins to unravel when the conversation turns to the moral conflicts he faced during his time in Ukraine. While he insists he was merely following orders, his accounts of looting and the atrocities he witnessed reveal a much darker reality. These incidents, though he downplays his involvement, expose the ethical breakdown that permeated the ranks of the invading forces and challenge his self-portrayal as a passive participant. One of the starkest examples came during an operation in a small village outside Volnovakha. Grigori's unit had been ordered to secure the area, but what unfolded went beyond military objectives. Soldiers began breaking into homes, ransacking cupboards, and carting away whatever they deemed valuable: food, electronics, even clothing. Grigori, by his own admission, was present during these raids but claimed he didn't actively participate. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice defensive. "I just stood guard." However, his interviewer pressed him on his complicity. Even if Grigori didn't loot, he stood by and watched as his comrades did, his weapon slung over his shoulder, his uniform a symbol of authority. "I didn't stop them," he admitted after a pause. "But what could I do? If I said anything, they would have turned on me." This reasoning, a mix of fear and helplessness, was central to Grigori's justification, yet it underscored the ethical compromises he made to survive. Another incident revealed the dehumanization that had taken hold among the soldiers. Grigori described a checkpoint his unit manned on a rural road. One day, a group of Ukrainian civilians approached, a family seeking safe passage. The father, desperate and visibly afraid, offered what little money they had to secure their way through. Grigori said he didn't take part in the decision, but he watched as his commanding officer confiscated their belongings, cash, a gold wedding ring, and even a bag of groceries. "I didn't agree with it," Grigori claimed, "but I didn't have a choice." The contradiction in Grigori's account is stark. He presents himself as a powerless observer, unwilling to participate in the moral decay around him, yet his silence and inaction made him complicit. By choosing not to intervene, he became a part of the machine that stripped civilians of their dignity and belongings. The interviewer pointed out the disparity between his claimed innocence and the harm his presence enabled, but Grigori's response was evasive. "It wasn't my decision," he repeated, as though absolution could be found in the hierarchy of command. Perhaps the most disturbing moment in Grigori's narrative came during an offensive that targeted a civilian area. His unit was stationed on the outskirts of a village, tasked with holding their position while artillery pounded the settlement. Grigori recalled hearing the distant screams of civilians and the cries of children amid the explosions. "It was horrible," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't want to be there." Yet, when asked why he didn't refuse to follow orders or attempt to leave, his answer was the same: fear of reprisal. What stood out in this account was Grigori's inability to reconcile his role in these events. While he didn't pull the trigger or launch the artillery, his presence as part of the occupying force enabled the destruction. He seemed to grasp the moral weight of what was happening, but instead of taking responsibility, he retreated into a narrative of helplessness. The interviewer didn't let this contradiction slide, pointing out that Grigori's inaction perpetuated the very atrocities he claimed to abhor. The ethical breakdown extended beyond these specific incidents. Grigori spoke of moments when soldiers in his unit laughed about the suffering of civilians, mocking the fear and desperation they encountered. He described feeling disgusted by their behavior, but admitted he never spoke out. "If I had said something, they would have turned on me," he said again, a refrain that began to feel more like an excuse than a justification. His silence, while understandable in the context of survival, betrayed a willingness to accept the dehumanization of others to protect himself. As the interview progressed, the layers of Grigori's self-portrayal began to peel away. The man who initially claimed to have been a passive, powerless bystander was revealed to have been a participant in a system that thrived on moral compromise. His reluctance to act against the injustices he witnessed, and, at times, his tacit acceptance of them, cast a shadow over his narrative of innocence. Grigori's story is a stark example of the ethical collapse that war can induce. His attempts to justify his inaction highlight the complex interplay between fear, survival, and morality. While he insists he wasn't directly involved in looting or violence, his presence and silence enabled those acts to continue unchecked. The atrocities he witnessed, and his failure to challenge them, speak to a broader truth about the moral erosion that occurs when individuals become complicit in systems of violence. And as his story unfolds, it forces us to confront a difficult question: is inaction in the face of injustice just as culpable as the act itself? Grigori Jivaev's capture was as sudden as it was harrowing. His unit had been stationed near a small village outside Volnovakha, tasked with holding their position as Ukrainian forces advanced. The chaos of battle had escalated quickly. Artillery shells exploded with deafening force, sending soldiers scattering for cover. Grigori, clutching his rifle, found himself separated from his unit amidst the confusion. For hours he wandered through fields of tall grass, disoriented and terrified. The sound of distant gunfire echoed around him, a constant reminder of the danger he faced. As night fell, Grigori made the decision to surrender. Alone, exhausted, and out of options, he stumbled toward a faint light in the distance, hoping it would lead to safety. Instead, he found himself face to face with Ukrainian soldiers. Their weapons were raised, their expressions hard and unyielding. Grigori dropped his rifle and raised his hands, shouting in broken Ukrainian, "I surrender." Don't shoot." His voice trembled, and his heart raced as he waited for their response. After a tense moment, the soldiers approached cautiously, binding his hands and patting him down for weapons. Grigori's first hours as a prisoner were marked by uncertainty. Blindfolded and transported to a nearby holding area, he was bombarded with questions in a language he barely understood. His fear was palpable, but so was his relief. He was alive, and for the first time in weeks, he was out of the immediate danger of combat. The Ukrainian soldiers, though firm, treated him with a level of professionalism that surprised him. He had been warned by his superiors that surrendering would lead to torture or death, but his initial treatment suggested otherwise. Once in the custody of Ukrainian authorities, Grigori was transferred to a makeshift prison camp. The facility, a repurposed building surrounded by barbed wire, was a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield he had just left. The conditions were basic: cramped sleeping quarters, minimal food, and a rigid daily routine. But they were far from the horror stories he had been led to believe. Grigori was interrogated regularly, the officers pressing him for information about his unit, their movements, and their objectives. He answered cautiously, revealing only what he believed was already known. "I just followed orders," he repeated over and over, hoping it would be enough to satisfy his captors. Despite his initial fears, Grigori found that his treatment as a prisoner was shaped by the Ukrainians' desire to uphold a standard of humanity in the face of war. He was given food, albeit simple and sparse, and medical attention for the minor injuries he sustained during his capture. The guards were firm but not unnecessarily cruel, a stark contrast to the propaganda he had been fed about how Russian soldiers would be treated if they were caught. This realization left Grigori with a complicated mix of emotions: gratitude for his survival, shame for his role in the invasion, and confusion about the reality of the war. Grigori's first days in captivity were spent in introspection. The adrenaline that had sustained him on the battlefield gave way to exhaustion, both physical and emotional. He thought about his family back in Chita, wondering if they knew he was alive and whether they believed the government's narrative of the war. He thought about the comrades he left behind, some likely dead, others still fighting. And he thought about the choices that had led him to this point, choices he often felt were not his own. As the days turned into weeks, Grigori began to adapt to his new reality. The interrogations continued, and while they were thorough, they lacked the brutality he had feared. The guards, though distant, occasionally exchanged small pleasantries or offered him cigarettes. These brief moments of humanity stood in stark contrast to the violence he had witnessed during the war. For Grigori, captivity was not just a physical state, but an opportunity to reflect on the ethical and personal compromises he had made as a soldier in an unjust war. His surrender marked the end of his role in the conflict, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where his actions, choices, and beliefs would be scrutinized under a lens he could no longer control. Grigori's time as a prisoner forced him to confront the reality of the war, the propaganda that had brought him here, and the cost of obedience in the face of moral dilemmas. And though he was no longer on the battlefield, the battles within him were just beginning. Grigori Jivaev's defense of his actions, or lack thereof, was a consistent refrain during his interview. "I didn't want to be here. I didn't have a choice. I didn't hurt anyone." These words, spoken with a mix of conviction and desperation, framed his narrative. Yet, as the interviewer delved deeper into his story, the cracks in his account began to surface. Grigori's insistence on innocence collided with the reality of his presence in Ukraine, exposing contradictions that cast doubt on his claims. Grigori maintained that he was an unwilling participant, coerced into the war by Russia's mobilization drive. He described the pressure he faced when the draft notice arrived at his door: the fear of imprisonment, the guilt of abandoning his family, and the lack of alternatives. "What was I supposed to do?" he asked, his tone defensive. "If I didn't go, they'd punish me. I had no choice." He had no choice. Yet the interviewer pointed out that others had resisted conscription, some even fleeing the country despite the risks. Why then did Grigori choose compliance over resistance? His response was evasive, shifting the blame to the system that ensnared him. "They made it impossible to say no," he argued. But the interviewer pressed further, challenging his narrative of helplessness. "Even if you were forced to join, you still crossed a border with a weapon in hand. You still stood guard while others looted homes. How do you reconcile that with your claim of innocence?" Grigori faltered, his gaze dropping. "I didn't think about it," he mumbled. I was just trying to survive. The contradictions became more apparent when Grigory recounted specific incidents. He claimed he never fired a shot during his time in Ukraine, emphasizing his reluctance to participate in violence. I wasn't there to kill anyone, he said, his voice firm. Yet, when asked about his role during operations, he admitted to guarding occupied areas and manning checkpoints. The interviewer seized on this inconsistency. You say you didn't want to hurt anyone, but by standing guard you allowed others to do so. Civilians were displaced, their homes destroyed. Doesn't that make you complicit? Grigory struggled to respond, his words a tangle of justification and denial. I didn't have a choice, he repeated, as though the phrase could absolve him. But the interviewer wasn't convinced. They pointed to the broader context of his actions, highlighting the moral implications of his presence. You may not have pulled the trigger, but your uniform, your weapon, they symbolize the force that invaded their country. Do you understand how that makes you part of the violence, even if indirectly? Another contradiction emerged in Grigory's account of the atrocities he witnessed. He described feeling horrified by the looting and destruction carried out by his comrades, insisting he didn't participate. I just watched, he said, as if passivity absolved him of responsibility. The interviewer challenged this notion, asking why he didn't intervene or report the misconduct. Grigory's response was immediate. If I said anything, they would have turned on me. I couldn't do anything. The interviewer countered with a pointed question. If you feared your comrades more than your enemy, what does that say about the nature of your unit? And by staying silent, didn't you enable their actions? Grigory hesitated, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the room. I didn't think about it like that, he admitted. I was scared. I just wanted to get through it. Grigory's portrayal of himself as a victim of circumstance was further undermined by his own words. He described moments of camaraderie with his unit, instances where he shared meals and conversations with the same men who committed the acts he claimed to oppose. They were just like me, he said, as though this commonality justified their behavior. The interviewer pointed out the irony. If they were just like you, does that mean you're capable of the same actions? Or are you saying they didn't have a choice either? Where does the responsibility lie? As the interview progressed, Grigory's defense unraveled further. His attempts to distance himself from the war's atrocities revealed a deep internal conflict, a struggle to reconcile his actions with his sense of morality. He wanted to be seen as a good person, a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. But the interviewer's questions forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth. By participating, even passively, he had played a role in the destruction. In the end, Grigory's narrative was one of contradiction. He claimed innocence while acknowledging his presence in an unjust war. He expressed horror at the violence but failed to act against it. He blamed the system for his choices but avoided taking personal responsibility. These contradictions painted a picture of a man grappling with the moral weight of his actions, desperate to believe he was a victim, but unable to escape the reality of his complicity. The interviewer's critiques left Grigory visibly shaken, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet resignation. His story, once carefully constructed to emphasize his helplessness, now seemed fragile and incomplete. And as he sat in silence, the weight of his words lingering in the air, one question remained. Could Grigory truly face the consequences of his choices, or would he continue to hide behind the narrative of a victim? Grigory Jivaev's narrative began to unravel further when the conversation shifted to his sense of responsibility for the events in Ukraine. For much of the interview, he clung to his refrain. I didn't have a choice. Yet, as the interviewer pressed him on specific moments, cracks began to appear in his defense. The probing questions exposed his complicity and the deep internal conflict he seemed desperate to avoid. One of the most telling moments came when the interviewer asked Grigory about his role in securing an occupied village. He had previously described standing guard as his comrades looted homes and intimidated civilians. You say you didn't take anything, the interviewer began, but you were there, holding a weapon, wearing the uniform of an invading army. Do you not see how your presence alone contributed to the fear and suffering of those people? Grigory's initial response was defensive. I didn't do anything wrong, he said quickly. I just stood there. I didn't threaten anyone. But as the interviewer pressed him further, his tone shifted. I guess, he mumbled after a long pause, I can see how it might have looked to them. They probably thought I was part of it. This admission, though hesitant, marked the beginning of his acknowledgement that his inaction had consequences. The interviewer didn't let up, pointing out how his silence in the face of wrongdoing made him complicit. You may not have looted, but you didn't stop it. You say you were afraid of your comrades turning on you. Does that fear justify allowing civilians to lose their homes and livelihoods? Grigori struggled to respond. What could I have done? He asked, his voice faltering. If I spoke up, they wouldn't have listened to me. They might have hurt me. The moment revealed a deeper truth about Grigori's internal conflict. He wanted to portray himself as a powerless victim, yet he couldn't escape the realization that his inaction had enabled the very acts he claimed to oppose. The weight of this realization was evident in his demeanor. His shoulders slumped. His voice grew quieter, and his once confident assertions gave way to uncertainty. Another point of contention arose when Grigori was asked about an incident involving a group of civilians detained at a checkpoint. His unit had been ordered to hold them for hours in freezing weather, denying them access to shelter or water. Grigori claimed he didn't agree with the decision, but admitted he didn't intervene. I just followed orders, he said again, his words now tinged with resignation. The interviewer pressed harder. Did it ever occur to you that following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility? Those people suffered because you and your unit chose to obey rather than question. For a moment, Grigori seemed lost in thought, as though weighing the question's implications. I didn't know what to do, he said eventually. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would be over faster. I didn't think it was my place to argue. The interviewer leaned in, their tone sharp. And do you think the civilians you detained cared about your silence? Or do you think they saw you as just another soldier contributing to their suffering? The weight of the question hung in the air, and Grigori's expression shifted. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the enormity of his role, even as he struggled to articulate it. I guess I didn't think about it that way, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think about how they saw me. I just wanted to get through it. This moment of vulnerability laid bare the contradictions in Grigori's narrative. He had spent much of the interview painting himself as an outsider, someone caught up in a system beyond his control. But his own words betrayed an awareness of his complicity. He knew his actions, or lack thereof, had contributed to the suffering around him, even if he couldn't fully admit it to himself. The interview reached its most intense point when the conversation turned to an artillery attack on a civilian area near his base. Grigori was not directly involved in the shelling, but he was present, standing watch as the artillery units fired round after round. He described hearing the screams of civilians and the cries of children in the distance, a sound that still haunted him. I didn't do it, he said, his voice shaking. I didn't fire the artillery. The interviewer's response was immediate. But you stood there. You watched. And you did nothing to stop it. Grigori's hands trembled as he spoke. What could I have done? He asked, his voice breaking. I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want any of it. The exchange left Grigori visibly shaken. His attempts to reconcile his actions with his sense of morality had reached a breaking point. For the first time, he seemed to confront the reality that his presence in the war had consequences, regardless of his intent. His internal conflict was laid bare. A man torn between the desire to see himself as a victim and the undeniable truth of his complicity. By the end of the segment, Grigori's defenses were in tatters. His repeated claims of innocence had given way to hesitant admissions of guilt, though he still struggled to take full responsibility. His story, once a carefully constructed narrative of helplessness, now stood as a testament to the moral ambiguity of war. And as the interviewer concluded their questioning, one thing was clear. Grigori's greatest battle was not on the battlefield but within himself, as he grappled with the weight of his actions and the reality of his choices. Grigori Zhivaev's understanding of the war was profoundly shaped by the relentless stream of propaganda that flowed through Russian state media. Growing up in Chita, a remote and tightly knit community, Grigori's worldview was largely influenced by what he saw on television and heard on the radio. State-controlled outlets dominated the airwaves, weaving a narrative that justified the war in Ukraine as a necessary and noble effort to protect Russian interests and liberate a supposed oppressed population. For Grigori, these stories became the foundation of his understanding of the conflict, simple, clear, and entirely deceptive. In his interview, Grigori admitted that he hadn't questioned the information he received before his conscription. I thought we were helping, he said, repeating a refrain that echoed the official rhetoric of the Kremlin. Russian media had painted Ukraine as a hotbed of neo-Nazism, a country overtaken by extremists who threatened Russia's security and the well-being of its Russian-speaking population. This narrative, repeated endlessly, served a dual purpose: to dehumanize Ukrainians and to instill a sense of duty among Russian citizens. We were told they were our enemies, Grigori recalled, his voice tinged with the realization of how deeply he had believed the lie. The propaganda went beyond the war itself, portraying Russia as a besieged nation, constantly under threat from the West. Grigory explained how this narrative fostered a sense of unity and fear among people in his community. They told us that NATO was closing in, that we had to defend ourselves before it was too late, he said. The imagery of foreign soldiers on Russian borders, though entirely fabricated, created a siege mentality that justified preemptive action in the minds of many. For Grigory, it made the idea of conscription seem like a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The effectiveness of this propaganda lay in its ability to exploit existing fears and grievances. Economic hardship and social instability in rural Russia had left people like Grigory searching for a sense of purpose and pride. The state media provided both, offering a narrative where ordinary citizens became heroes, fighting to preserve their country's sovereignty against external threats. They made it sound like we were saving the world, Grigory admitted, reflecting on the stories he consumed daily, like we were the good guys. But the cracks in this narrative began to show once Grigory was deployed to Ukraine. The reality on the ground was starkly different from what he had been led to believe. The Ukrainian towns he entered were not hotbeds of extremism, but ordinary communities devastated by the war. The civilians he encountered were not hostile militants, but frightened families trying to survive. I didn't see the Nazis they talked about, Grigory confessed, his voice hesitant. I saw people like us, just trying to live. The dissonance between propaganda and reality forced Grigory to confront the lies he had accepted without question. Yet, even in captivity, he struggled to let go of the narrative entirely. Maybe the media exaggerated, he admitted, but we still believed we were doing the right thing. This partial acknowledgement of the truth highlighted the lingering influence of propaganda, which had shaped not only his understanding of the war, but also his sense of identity as a soldier. The interviewer challenged Grigory on his complicity in perpetuating these lies. Did you ever stop to question what you were being told? Did you ever think about the people on the other side of the border? They asked. Grigory hesitated before answering. Not really, he said. We didn't have time to think about that. We just trusted what they told us. This uncritical acceptance of state narratives revealed the power of propaganda in shaping perceptions and suppressing dissent. Grigory's story was not unique. It was emblematic of a broader phenomenon in which ordinary individuals, overwhelmed by misinformation and fear, became complicit in acts they might otherwise have opposed. By the time they realized the truth, the damage had already been done. Grigory's experience serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked propaganda. It weaponizes trust, turning ordinary citizens into tools of the state. For Grigory, the realization came too late. I should have asked more questions, he admitted near the end of the segment. I should have thought for myself. His words were filled with regret, a recognition of how easily he had been manipulated into participating in a war that brought destruction, not liberation. The influence of propaganda on Grigory's life was profound, shaping not just his decision to go to war, but his understanding of right and wrong. Even as he grappled with the moral weight of his actions, the lingering echoes of state narratives made it difficult for him to fully confront the truth. And in this, Grigory's story becomes more than just an account of one man's journey. It becomes a cautionary tale about the insidious power of propaganda and the responsibility of individuals to seek the truth, even when it is buried beneath layers of lies. Grigory Jivaev's perspective on the war often came across as disturbingly detached. In his interview, he described his experiences in Ukraine with a sense of distance, as though recounting events that had happened to someone else. Yet, the interviewer's probing questions painted a vivid picture of the devastation left in the wake of his unit's actions. The contrast between Grigory's clinical descriptions and the human cost of the war was striking, exposing the disconnect between his personal narrative and the larger consequences of his presence in Ukraine. Grigory spoke of the villages his unit occupied as mere locations, defined by their strategic value rather than the lives disrupted by their invasion. We were told to secure the area and keep watch, he said matter-of-factly, describing his role during an operation, but the interviewer pressed him to look beyond the military orders. What did you see in those villages? What was left after your unit moved in? They asked. For a moment, Grigory hesitated. The houses were damaged, he admitted. There were people, but they stayed away from us. We didn't interact with them. The interviewer countered with a pointed observation. Do you think they stayed away because they wanted to, or because they were terrified of the soldiers who had invaded their homes? Grigory looked down, avoiding the question. I didn't think about that, he said quietly. The interviewer then recounted the scenes described by Ukrainian civilians, families hiding in basements for days, afraid to emerge while soldiers ransacked their homes. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, with survivors forced to search through debris for any belongings they could salvage. Do you remember seeing them? The interviewer asked. Grigori nodded slowly. I saw some people digging through the ruins, he said. I thought they were looking for something. I didn't realize. I didn't think they might have been living there. The devastation went beyond physical destruction. The interviewer described the psychological toll of the occupation. Children crying themselves to sleep, elders begging for basic necessities, and families torn apart by violence. Did you ever think about what it must have been like for them? They asked. Grigori shifted uncomfortably. I guess it must have been hard, he said, his voice lacking conviction. But we didn't do anything to them directly. The interviewer seized on his detached response. You say you didn't do anything, but your presence alone brought fear and suffering. Every patrol, every checkpoint, every weapon you carried was a reminder to them that their lives were no longer their own. Do you understand that? Grigori struggled to answer. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. I was just doing what I was told. One particularly stark moment in the interview came when the interviewer described a specific village near Volnovakha. After days of shelling, Ukrainian forces found bodies buried under the rubble of homes and schools. Civilians who survived described watching loved ones die in their arms, unable to escape the bombardment. That was one of the villages your unit passed through, the interviewer said. What do you remember about it? Grigori's response was chillingly detached. It was mostly empty, he said. There were some destroyed buildings, but we didn't stay there long. The interviewer's voice grew sharper. Did you ever wonder why it was empty? Did you think about the people who used to live there? The children who went to school there? Grigori's expression faltered. I didn't think about that, he said again, his tone now tinged with regret. The interviewer pressed further, asking Grigori to reconcile his detached descriptions with the very real suffering they had witnessed. When you saw civilians walking past with everything they owned in plastic bags, when you saw old women crying at checkpoints, did you not wonder what your role in their suffering was? Grigori sighed heavily, his earlier defensiveness giving way to a quiet admission. I thought about it sometimes, he said. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help. This moment revealed the heart of Grigori's detachment, a coping mechanism to shield himself from the moral weight of his actions. By focusing on orders and routines, he could avoid confronting the human cost of the war. Yet, as the interviewer described the stories of civilians who had lived through the occupation, it became clear that Grigori's detachment came at a cost. His refusal to engage with the suffering around him perpetuated the very cycle of destruction he claimed to oppose. In the end, the contrast between Grigori's perspective and the devastation described by the interviewer underscored the dehumanizing nature of war. For Grigori, the villages were locations. The people were civilians. And the destruction was simply damage. But for those who lived through it, the war was a nightmare that upended their lives. And as Grigori grappled with this reality, his detachment began to crack, revealing a man struggling to reconcile his actions with the suffering he could no longer ignore. Grigori Jivaev's story is not just his own. It is the story of the family he left behind and the legacy of his choices. As he sits in captivity, thousands of miles from his home in Chita, he wrestles with the ripple effects of his decisions, both on himself and on the loved ones who remain in the shadow of his actions. For Grigori, the family he left behind is a constant presence in his thoughts. His wife, a quiet and resilient woman, had pleaded with him not to go when the conscription notice arrived. She told me to find a way out, to refuse, Grigori admitted, his voice heavy with regret. But I didn't know how. I couldn't risk prison. What would happen to her if I wasn't there to help? In choosing to comply, Grigori believed he was protecting his family from immediate hardship. Yet, as he spoke about the months that followed, it became clear that his absence had only deepened their struggles. Back in Chita, his wife was left to manage the household alone. The modest garden that once sustained them became her sole responsibility, along with the daily grind of maintaining their home. She had no certainty about his fate, no guarantee he would return. Letters were infrequent and vague, limited by the censorship of military communication. I couldn't tell her anything real, Grigori explained. I didn't want her to worry more than she already was. But the interviewer pressed him, pointing out that the silence only added to her burden. Do you think she worried less because you withheld the truth? They asked. Grigori hesitated, his expression pained. No, he admitted quietly. She probably worried more. The strain on his family extended beyond physical hardships. Grigori's parents, though supportive in their own way, had also been devastated by his conscription. His mother, who had already raised her children through years of economic uncertainty, now faced the fear of losing her son to a war she neither understood nor supported. She didn't say much, Grigori recalled, but I could see it in her eyes. She was scared for me. The war, sold to Russians as a noble cause, had instead sown fear and grief among the very people it claimed to protect. Grigori's captivity added another layer of complexity to his family's ordeal. Though he was no longer in immediate danger, the uncertainty of his future weighed heavily on them. His wife, struggling to make ends meet, now bore the stigma of being the spouse of a captured soldier. In small communities like Chita, where gossip spread quickly, this association carried a social cost. "She's probably being judged," Grigori said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People will think she's married to a traitor." The interviewer pressed him on this point, asking if he had considered how his choices might affect his family's reputation. Grigori's response was telling. "I didn't think about it at the time," he admitted. "I was just trying to do what I thought was best for them. I didn't realize how much worse it could get." This admission highlighted the gap between his intentions and the unintended consequences of his actions. In captivity, Grigori's thoughts often drifted to the question of legacy. He spoke of his desire to return home and rebuild his life, but he also acknowledged the challenge of facing the stigma and judgment that awaited him. "What will people think of me?" he asked, his tone tinged with fear. "Will they see me as a failure? A coward?" The interviewer pointed out that the judgment he feared might stem less from his capture and more from his role in the war itself. "Do you think your community will forgive you for being part of an invasion, even if you claim you didn't want to be there?" they asked. Grigori had no answer. The weight of his choices also bore heavily on how he viewed his future family. Grigori and his wife had planned to have children, but he now questioned what kind of legacy he could pass on to them. "What would I tell my kids about what I did?" he wondered aloud. "How would I explain why I went to Ukraine?" The interviewer seized on this moment of vulnerability, asking if he thought honesty would be enough to reconcile his actions. Grigori shook his head. "I don't know if I could ever make them understand," he said. "I don't fully understand it myself." Grigori's reflections in captivity reveal a man grappling with the far-reaching consequences of his decisions. The impact on his family, financially, emotionally, and socially, was profound, and his own sense of identity and legacy had been irreparably altered. While he claimed to have joined the war to protect his loved ones, the reality was that his absence and actions had brought them more pain than he ever anticipated. In the quiet moments of his captivity, Grigori often found himself questioning whether he could ever make amends. "I don't know if they'll forgive me," he said of his wife and family. "I don't even know if I can forgive myself." His story, shaped by the intersecting forces of propaganda, duty, and fear, was no longer just his own. It belonged to the family he left behind, the community he would one day face, and the generations that might inherit the weight of his choices. Grigori Jivaev's days in captivity were monotonous yet heavy with reflection. His new routine bore little resemblance to the chaotic and unpredictable life he had known on the battlefield. For the first time in months, there was no constant fear of death, no explosions shaking the earth, and no orders barked in urgency. Yet, the stillness of captivity brought its own challenges, forcing Grigori to confront the choices that had led him to this place. Each morning began with the sound of footsteps in the corridor as guards made their rounds, unlocking the doors to the prisoners' shared sleeping quarters. Grigori and the other detainees would rise, fold their thin blankets, and line up for roll call. The air was cold and damp, and the dim lighting added to the pervasive sense of bleakness. Meals followed, a meager portion of porridge or bread accompanied by weak tea. "It's not much, but it's enough to keep us going," Grigori said, his tone resigned. The food, while plain, was better than what he'd had during his deployment, where hunger was a constant companion. The days were structured but uneventful. Chores were assigned to keep the prisoners occupied, sweeping floors, cleaning shared spaces, or helping to maintain the camp's grounds. Grigori often volunteered for these tasks, preferring the physical activity to the idle hours that stretched endlessly otherwise. "It's better to be doing something," he explained. "If you sit too long, you start thinking too much, and that's when it gets hard." The time between meals was filled with repetitive routines and the occasional interrogation. The guards were strict but not abusive, a fact that surprised Grigori given the stories he'd been told before his capture. "They treat us fairly," he admitted. "It's not comfortable, but they don't go out of their way to make it worse." Interrogations, while mentally taxing, had become less frequent as the weeks wore on. Initially, they were intense, with officers probing for information about his unit and the Russian military's movements. Now, they seemed more focused on understanding the mindset of the soldiers sent to fight an unjust war. For Grigory, these sessions were an emotional minefield, forcing him to recount events he would rather forget. The evenings were the hardest. With no work to distract him, and the other prisoners retreating into their own thoughts, the silence became suffocating. Grigory often sat alone, staring at the small window in his cell. Through the bars, he could see the night sky, a rare reminder of the world beyond the camp. "It's the only time I feel free," he said, "even if it's just for a moment." Yet, these moments of quiet reflection often brought with them a flood of guilt and regret. He thought about his family, the friends he had lost, and the civilians he had seen suffering during the war. "I keep replaying it in my head," he admitted, wondering what I could have done differently. Interactions with fellow prisoners were limited but not unfriendly. Most of them shared similar stories. Young men swept up in a conflict they hadn't chosen, now grappling with the consequences of their actions. Conversations, when they happened, revolved around home, family, and the uncertain future that awaited them. Grigory found some solace in these exchanges, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggles. "We don't talk about the war much," he explained. "It's too painful, and everyone's trying to move on." Grigory's emotional state was a mix of resignation and introspection. On the surface, he maintained a stoic demeanor, performing his tasks and following orders without complaint. But beneath this exterior, he was deeply troubled. The weight of his choices, the role he had played in the war, and the uncertainty of his future all loomed large in his mind. "It's like I'm trapped in my own head," he said. "Even though the war is over for me, it's still there, every day." The monotony of captivity left Grigory with little else to do but reflect. At times, he clung to the hope of returning home, imagining the day he might see his wife and family again. But these thoughts were tempered by the fear of how he would be received. "I don't know if they'll forgive me," he said, "or if I'll even forgive myself." For Grigory, daily life in captivity was not just about enduring the routine. It was about surviving the emotional toll of his situation. Each day brought new reminders of the choices he had made, the people he had left behind, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. And as he fell asleep each night, the same thoughts haunted him. Could he ever move past what he had done? And if he could, would anyone else let him? Grigory Zhivaev's reflections in captivity offer a glimpse into a man struggling to come to terms with his role in the war. When asked about what he had learned from his experiences, his responses revealed a mix of regret, self-justification, and confusion. Despite his repeated assertions that he never wanted to fight, the question lingered. Did Grigory truly grasp the weight of his actions and their impact on others? "I didn't have a choice," Grigory said again, his familiar refrain. He repeated this line like a shield, as if the act of compliance absolved him of responsibility. "What could I have done? If I refused, I'd be in prison. My family needed me to stay out of trouble." Yet, the interviewer wasn't satisfied with this explanation. "You say you didn't have a choice, but you made choices every day. You chose to wear the uniform, to carry the weapon, to stand guard while others suffered. Do you understand that these were still choices, even if they didn't feel like it at the time?" Grigory faltered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I guess I didn't think about it like that," he admitted. I just tried to survive." This admission was a recurring theme in his reflections, a focus on survival that seemed to overshadow any deeper consideration of the consequences of his actions. He acknowledged feeling conflicted about some of the things he had witnessed, but when pressed to explain why he didn't act differently, his answers were vague. "It's not like I could have stopped it," he said. "One person can't change everything." The interviewer probed further, asking if he thought survival alone was enough to justify his inaction. "Do you think the people whose homes were destroyed or whose families were killed care whether you were just trying to survive?" they asked. Grigory hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Probably not," he said quietly. "I don't think they would." This acknowledgement seemed to open a door to a deeper level of introspection. Grigory began to speak more openly about the moments that haunted him. He described the civilians he had seen displaced by the war, their fear, their desperation. "I didn't really think about them at the time," he admitted. "I was too focused on getting through it myself. But now I can't stop thinking about it. How scared they must have been, how helpless." Despite these moments of reflection, there were limits to Grigory's self-awareness. When asked if he felt responsible for the suffering he had witnessed, he hesitated again. "I don't know," he said finally. I didn't do those things. I didn't hurt anyone directly, but I guess I didn't stop it either. His voice trailed off, the weight of his words seemingly hitting him for the first time. The interviewer pressed him on this point, asking if he thought his role as part of the occupying force made him complicit. "You were there," they said. "You represented the army that invaded their land. Even if you didn't pull the trigger, your presence was part of the fear they felt. Do you understand that?" Grigori nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "I think so," he said. "I never thought about it like that before, but yeah, I can see that now." This moment of clarity was fleeting. When asked if he would have done anything differently given the chance, Grigori's response was tentative. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe I would have tried to refuse, but I don't know if I'd have the courage to do it. It's easy to say now, but back then, it didn't feel like I had a choice." His words revealed a man still grappling with the boundaries of his agency, torn between regret and the need to rationalize his decisions. The interviewer concluded by asking Grigori what he hoped to take away from his experience. "I don't know," he said again, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I guess I just want to understand why it all happened, why we were sent there, why I made the choices I did." These questions, though sincere, highlighted the complexity of Grigori's journey. While he had begun to acknowledge the consequences of his actions, he remained far from fully accepting his role in the war. Grigori's reflections suggested a man caught in the liminal space between denial and accountability. He had started to confront the truth of his complicity, but was still searching for ways to reconcile it with his sense of self. Whether he truly grasped the weight of his actions remained uncertain. His words and demeanor hinted at a deeper understanding slowly taking shape, but the process of coming to terms with his past would likely be a long and painful one. And as the interviewer concluded their questioning, the unresolved nature of Grigori's introspection left a haunting question. Would he ever fully reckon with the role he played, or would he remain trapped in the shadow of his choices? As Grigori Jivaev's story draws to a close, the question of accountability looms large. His experiences, shaped by fear, coercion, and self-preservation, are emblematic of the countless soldiers caught in the machinery of war. Yet, while Grigori wrestles with his own guilt and complicity, the broader need for justice and healing takes center stage. The path forward, for individuals like Grigori and for the communities ravaged by conflict, is fraught but necessary. For Grigori, accountability begins with acknowledgement. Throughout his interview, he grappled with the weight of his actions, often retreating into justifications but occasionally breaking through to moments of clarity. His presence in Ukraine, his uniform, and his silence all contributed to the suffering he witnessed. Now, as he sits in captivity, the process of reckoning has begun. "I can't change what happened," he said quietly, "but I know I was part of it. I have to live with that." The interviewer pressed Grigori on what accountability meant to him. Did he believe it was enough to admit guilt, or did he think action was required? His response was halting but sincere. I think we need to make things right," he said. "Not just me, but all of us who were part of it. We need to find a way to help the people we hurt, even if it's just by telling the truth." This realization, though tentative, hinted at a deeper understanding of the importance of accountability, not just as an individual act, but as part of a collective effort to address the harm caused by the war. For the victims of the conflict, justice takes many forms. It is the rebuilding of homes, schools, and communities destroyed by violence. It is the recognition of their suffering and the provision of reparations to help them heal. And it is the pursuit of those responsible for the atrocities, the leaders who orchestrated the invasion, the commanders who gave the orders, and, yes, even the soldiers who carried them out. Justice is not about revenge, but about creating a foundation for reconciliation and preventing future conflicts. The interviewer reflected on the stories of Ukrainian civilians who had endured unimaginable loss, parents grieving for their children, families torn apart, and communities left in ruins. For these individuals, healing cannot begin until there is acknowledgement and accountability from those who caused their pain. The people of Ukraine deserve more than just apologies, the interviewer said. They deserve to rebuild their lives without fear, and they deserve to know that those responsible will face the consequences. Grigori nodded, his expression somber. "I understand that now," he said. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can tell the truth about what happened. Maybe that's a start." His words, while imperfect, reflected a growing sense of responsibility. By sharing his story, Grigori hoped to contribute to the broader reckoning required to address the war's legacy. But healing is not only for the victims, it is also for those who participated in the conflict. Soldiers like Grigori, many of whom were thrust into the war under duress, must confront their own guilt and trauma. For them, healing means moving beyond denial and facing the truth of their actions. It means acknowledging the harm they caused and finding ways to make amends. It is a long and difficult process, but one that is essential for their own redemption and for the rebuilding of trust between nations. The interviewer concluded by asking Grigori what he envisioned for his future. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to go home to see my family again. But I know it won't be the same. I'll carry this with me for the rest of my life." His voice was steady but tinged with regret, a man coming to terms with the weight of his past. "I just hope that, somehow, we can all learn from this, that we can find a way to make sure it doesn't happen again. The path to accountability and healing after a war is never easy. It requires truth-telling, justice, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities." For Grigori, his story is a small but significant piece of a larger puzzle, a story of complicity, regret, and the possibility of redemption. And for Ukraine, the journey toward rebuilding will be long. But it will be driven by resilience and the determination to reclaim a future free from the shadows of war. As Grigori's narrative ends, the lessons of his experience remain. Accountability is not just about punishment, but about creating the conditions for healing. Justice is not just about retribution, but about rebuilding what was lost. And healing is not just about forgetting, but about forging a path forward, shaped by the hard-won knowledge of what must never happen again.